Around the first of every year, John Deere cylinder heads roll into the machine shop in masses as the farmers realize that their time left to get everything that broke down last fall fixed before spring is running out. Or it may just be a coincidence, but knowing a lot of farmers, we're pretty sure that it's the first one. Despite many of these heads being from tractors that are 40, 50, or even 60 plus years old, they're still some of the most common cylinder heads that we see come through our machine shop here in rural Colorado. If you're not a fan of John Deere tractors, you may try to make the argument that they're the most common in the machine shop because they break down the most often, but the honest truth is that John Deere dealerships have always had a strong presence in our area, and they're one of, if not the best-selling tractor brand in the United States. Sorry, Dad. Regardless of the vintage, the fuel type, or the number of cylinders, the first step of any job in our machine shop is the teardown and the cleaning. For one, we don't like dirtying up our machines with nasty, greasy parts, but more importantly, it makes everything easier to see during our inspection process. Before we get too deep into it, we wanted to thank our friends over at SB International for sponsoring this video. There will be more on them later, but be sure to check out their website and social media links in the description. Kind of give us the rundown. You've got them all torn down and cleaned up at least, but
yeah, they're at least most of the way clean. What's kind of funny here is we've ended up with a whole bunch of these John Deeres that are all real close to the same vintage. We start out here with a 4010 John Deere head that would have been the very first series that they came out when they went to the 6-cylinder diesel engine. And then we have a 4020 head here that's just a little bit newer. And then down here on top on the floor, we have a late model 4020, and below that is a 4230 head, which is the next series of tractor that came along after the 4020. And then just for fun, over here we have a 3020 gas head. Same style engine, other than it's just a 4-cylinder and runs on gasoline instead of diesel. Usually we don't have this many of the same heads at the same time to really be able to make comparisons, but I thought it'd just be fun to look at some of these. So we've got the 4010, we've got the very next series of 4020. This is probably real early 60s. This engine may be mid 60s, late 60s. They are different casting numbers, but when you lay the two heads side by side here, for all intents and purposes, these look to be exactly the same. But anyway, if I tip this up to look at it, you'll see that these heads use the larger, I think what I've heard people refer to as a Bendix type injector, Chantilly Bendix. Those at this point are very expensive to work on. I've heard people complaining about those. But both of these heads use that type of injector. Now I roll it on over here where you can see the combustion chamber side here. This head has been worked on and somebody has already installed hard exhaust seats. They look to be down in there pretty deep. We're going to pull those out and probably put all the seats in new. This here, the 3010 head, I don't know if you can see it here, but the valves are smaller diameter. That is the change that I saw in the years there between a 4010, 4020. They did increase the size of the valves, both intake and exhaust, by about 1/8 of an inch. Again, on this head, it has had all the seats put in at some other time. This head was on an engine that had sat full of moisture, and it was quite rusty, but we've got it cleaned up there to do the machine work on it. It will not be pretty as far as the cosmetic look of it, but it will be fully functional. Again, that won't bother anything other than just the looks of it there. So let's Magnaflex these two. Sometimes you may see a small little crack between the injector opening and the valve seat, but that's nothing we even worry about. Once in a while we'll get one that may be a big crack that comes out across the combustion chamber from the valve seat. But these heads, I really was not anticipating finding any cracks. There was no...
Yeah, I mean, that one's got like the little one that goes to the injector, like you said.
Yeah.
It's just barely.
There's just almost have to use your imagination there to see that it's there. Another thing these heads have is replaceable valve guides. These guides will drive out, and we can drive new ones right back in without any further machine work other than a little bit of finish work on the inside of the guide once it's in there. So I think we're probably okay to proceed with machine work on these. So I will probably press like a freeze plug or a washer inside the existing seats here, run a bead of weld around that, pop all those out, and then we'll start over with new seats and put seats in on the intake side of this, because they are quite deep. It's had several valve jobs along the way. Yep. So anyway, let's go ahead and take these two heads off the bench, and we'll bring up the next two we have there and make some comparisons on them. Now this head is also a 4020, but it is one of the newer 4020s, as opposed to this other one we had down here was a real early 4020. And some of the differences are, I guess the deck surface of the block changed between the early and the late. So this has, they kind of called it the narrow head. It's not quite as wide at the base where it mounts on the, like on the side here where it comes out. John Deere went to integral type valve guides. These are not removable. I'll have to actually drill those and put an insert in to replace the valve guides on this, as opposed to the older heads. You could just drive one out, drive another one in. You know, you put them side by side, they look a lot alike. The port design is still the same. They use the larger intake and exhaust valves like the earlier 4020 was, but they went to a single groove type keeper as opposed to a, this is a single groove keeper with an O-ring on there, where the older one had a double groove beadlock type keeper on the valves. Still no valve seats from the factory. In fact, I don't think this head has ever been done before. I'm pretty sure this is the first time anybody's worked on this, and you can see there are no valve seats in there. So we will cut those out, put in new valve seats so we can bring the valves back up to the top side of spec. Helps the tractor start a lot easier.
What's the year range on this one? Do you know?
This would be late 60s. Don't quote me on this, I'm just kind of guessing, but late 60s up through maybe about 72-ish is the range of those tractors. And then you'll see here on the injectors, they went from that big fat Bendix injector to these just use the little pencil injectors. Still has one bolt to hold it down, but they're a real small diameter. Literally really is no bigger than a pencil. In spite of these things being 55, 60 years old, we still see these come through the shop, which is obvious by what we have in here right now.
At any one time, I think we have more John Deere in our shop than anything else.
Oh yeah.
It's by far, I mean, even to the point of the little 2-cylinder John Deeres that we're doing right now.
We have 2 of those in here. We're trying to get those sleeves put in. John Deere's popular tractor, plus I think we have good dealer support in this area that has contributed to some of them being here. And I don't see any cracks there of any concern. So now this head is off of a 4230 John Deere, which was the next model of tractor that came out in the early 70s to replace the 4020. The head still looks very much the same as this one, but now they've changed injectors again. They went to a bigger diameter injector again. It's threaded in the top here. It actually has a nut that screws down in to hold the injector in place. And I think this is what they call a Bosch injector. And as everything does, every iteration of this, they went up a little bit more in horsepower. I was kind of looking online last night trying to get an idea. It sounded like these old 4010s, or what down here, started out maybe not quite 90 horsepower, and then as they went to the 4020, they hit the 100 horsepower range. And then I saw some information that said this engine was up maybe 110 horsepower. So it's gradually kept going up, and I think a lot of that was through the use of probably different pistons in the block, different shapes on the pistons, different fuel system. They just kept improving all along the way. So as the horsepower increases, more stress on everything in the engine. When we flip this head over here, you'll see this head came from the factory with all hardened valve seats. They finally got to the point where just grinding the seat into the cast iron no longer would stand up, so they did put seats in it from the factory. And again, I can see this head has been done at least once before. I can see the way the cuts are on the seats. It's not factory. We'll go ahead and pull those seats out, put new ones back in, bring the valves back up so we can get our proper valve recession, so this tractor will start and run real nice. And again, the integral valve guides, we'll drill those, put inserts in. But for all practical purposes, in general, there's not a whole lot of difference between that old 4010 head and when we got to the 4230. Difference in valve size, different injectors, different seat materials. Oh, there's one. That's pretty good. If you get the light on that right, can you see that one between the injector and the seat? And like we said earlier, that's very common, creates no problem whatsoever.
Because there's nothing between.
Yeah, where that, it's more like a little heat crack. There's another one showing up. Now, if you get one that comes from the injector and heads out across the chamber or the combustion face there, that's a problem. So anyway, looks like we've got 4 good heads there to start with. Let me move this one back off the bench, and let's grab that gas head and put it up here just to show some of the differences and similarities. Okay, so here we have our 3020 gas, being a 30 series tractor instead of 40 series. It's a 4-cylinder instead of 6-cylinder, but they also made 4010s and 20s in gasoline versions. From this side, the head looks very similar. I think looking at it from this side, I would not know if this was gas or diesel.
Until you started looking.
Yeah, this one is an older model, so it has the replaceable valve guides in it. And again, when you got a little bit newer, they went to the integral guides on them. But once I flip on this side, I see, oh, wait a minute. Instead of holes for injectors, I have holes for spark plugs. And then I flip the head on over on this side, and we'll flip this one over just for comparison. Diesel head, no combustion chamber. Gasoline head has a combustion chamber. And this head too has been done before. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think these would have had hard seat inserts from the factory on the exhaust side, but I don't think they did on the intake side, but I don't remember for sure. But this head has been done before. It's had seats put in, both intake and exhaust. I don't think that long ago.
It does not look beat out.
This customer's complaint was that this engine was real hard starting. I'm not convinced that the head was the problem of this hard starting. But anyway, we could see when he brought it in and was looking at it, there was a lot of dirt and dust in the intake ports. I think he had some kind of issue with a hole somewhere in the system between the air cleaner and the engine itself here. It had been sucking dirt in, so he may have some rings worn out on this thing too. But he's into it that far, so he said, now let's just go ahead and go through it, fix it right. He wants it to be like new again. So again here, I'm going to pull those valve seats out. I'll put new ones in because I want to bring the valves up as close to factory spec as I possibly can. To me, doing a John Deere head in the shop is like other shops doing a 350 Chevrolet, small block Chevrolet. That's what I consider. You know, a lot of the guys that consider small block Chevrolet their bread and butter, I consider John Deere's to be that for me.
Right off the bat, I saw this mark here and I thought it was a crack, but I don't think it.
I hope it's not.
I think it's just casting mark.
Yeah, there's some kind of a little casting flaw in there.
That'll scare you just eyeballing it there, though, because it does look like a crack almost.
Yeah, initially there. So I think at this point, I'll probably set up and start pulling some of these valve seats out and move over to the surface of the head so the face is done, and then move over, take care of the guide work, and then we'll finish on the Surrey, actually finishing the valve seats.
Okay, well, let's get to it.
With the heads clean and a quick inspection for cracks complete, we're going to move into doing the machine work, but we'll start with pulling the old seat inserts out of the heads which already have them. There are multiple different ways to remove the old seats, but one easy way is to use the MIG welder to weld a freeze plug into the seat, at which point they will either essentially fall out or can be driven out from the top side of the head. Before we begin any of the rest of the work on the valve guides or valve seats, we'll go ahead and resurface the head gasket surface of each head as well as the manifold sealing surface. On the diesel cylinder heads, it's important that we do this step before finishing our valve seats, as the critical valve recession specification is measured off of the head gasket surface. The goal is to simply take enough material off of the surfaces to clean up the gasket sealing areas for a good head gasket seal. Once the heads have been resurfaced, they'll move on to have the valve guide work done. In the case of the earlier head designs of the 4010, the 3020, and the early 4020, the cylinder heads came from the factory with replaceable false guides. However, after having been in the heads for decades, it's often not as simple as simply driving them out. If the guides don't want to immediately move, we will level up the head on our TCM25 valve guide machine and trim off the top of the guide flush with the head. This gives a nice surface to drive against, but if they're still tight, we can go a step further by core drilling them partway through to help relieve the press fit, thus allowing them to break loose. After the guides have been successfully removed, the guide bores are thoroughly cleaned and our new SBI cast iron OEM replacement guides are installed to the proper height using the hydraulic press or our hydraulic puller setup. In the case of the later 4020 head and the 4230 head, the factory design featured an integral valve guide as opposed to a false guide, meaning we actually have to core drill the guide bores in order to install the new valve guides. The guides we drive into these heads are also supplied by SBI and are a hardened, high tensile strength cast iron alloy. Although the heads would not have been this way from the factory, we like to take the additional step of cutting the tops of the newly installed guides for positive Viton valve stem seals, which we feel do a better job of metering the lubrication to the valve stem. The next step for the valve guides in all of these heads is to use a reamer to bring them close to the finished size before hitting them with a few strokes of our diamond valve guide hone to get within the factory valve stem clearance specification for our new SBI valves. For the later model head like the 4230, which had valve seat inserts from the factory, the correct size seat inserts can be selected and driven into the factory counterbores. In this case, we're using SBI seats in both the intake and exhaust positions, with the intake being an OEM equivalent seat, while the exhaust is one of their harder Star Series seats designed for increased hardness and improved thermal dissipation for heavy-duty applications. If the head did not have seat inserts from the factory or had odd-sized seat inserts from a previous repair, we can use our seat counterbore cutters to cut new counterbores and select a universal seat number from SBI to suit the application. With all of the new valve seats installed, the final step in the machining process is to move over to the Surrey 4.5 valve seat machine and cut our valve seats to the specified angles, widths, and valve recession depths. After the seat cutter has been adjusted, the seat will be roughed in before a valve is inserted and the valve recession is measured. If needed, we can then come back to that seat and finish it out to the required depth. Again, we're using all SBI valves in these cylinder heads. Something to note is that the later 4020 and the 4230 use the same intake and exhaust valves, although SBI does offer two different material options on the exhaust side. In this case, we use the OEM spec 751 Inconel exhaust valve in the 4230, while opting for the more cost-effective 2000 series Austinetic exhaust valves in the late 4020. We also mentioned earlier in the video that the main difference between the 4010 and the early 4020 was the head diameter on the valves. And while we always recommend doing your research before modifying parts and doing so at your own risk, we needed to modify the early 4020 valve part number to meet the 4010 specification. This was done by turning down the head diameter in our crankshaft grinder before regrinding the valve face on our valve grinder. These particular valves do not have any special features like a stellite face, and therefore this modification will not have any detrimental effects on the lifespan of the valve. When all of our machine work has been completed and specifications verified, each of the heads goes through one more cleaning in our spray cabinet before being rinsed thoroughly and blown dry. With the valve stems lubricated, the valves are installed into the valve guides and valve stem seals installed. The heads get new OEM equivalent valve springs, new hardened keepers, and new spring rotators or retainers, all from SBI. As always, the goal when these jobs leave our shop is for them to be better than new. Despite the small changes in each of these John Deere cylinder heads from the early 60s into the late 70s, the consistency of the overall design makes them easy and simple for machine shops like us to work on. It makes you wonder if, in part, this has played into the success of these early 4 and 6-cylinder John Deere tractors that replaced their 2-cylinder predecessors. And they must be pretty decent tractors for a guy who lives and breathes orange tractors to get caught making a comment like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.